way too many things for me to remember to do here. What I want to do is begin by prayer, but a little bit different than we normally do. Joan is here. So glad you're here. Desmond is not. Desmond, the cancer has returned. I think Jeff prayed for him by name and kind of let you know that last week. And Walt and I got a chance to visit with him a little bit this week. And chemo is hard on people, so I don't know what all the medical decisions are that lie in front of them. But I do know that we should lift them up in prayer and lift our sister up in prayer. So let's begin that way. Father God, I am so glad that you have made us part of the body. We don't go through life alone. We love one another, support one another, encourage one another, admonish one another. Weep with those who weep, rejoice with those who rejoice. It's a glorious thing to be part of the family of God. And right now, one of our brothers is ill with a disease, a cancer that is not kind and not easily treated. And we do not know what the doctors have for him, if anything. We know what you have for him ultimately. You have a resurrection body. You have a home. You have glory in your presence. You have an eternity where there are no more tears, no sickness. Cancer does not exist. What you have for him between now and then, Lord, we do not know. But we ask you for more years with our brother. We ask you for a remission of the cancer. We ask you for time that he can spend with Joan and with his family and with his friends and with us. We look for you to be merciful in that particular way, but we trust that whatever you do, you are merciful and you are good. We lift up Joan. Sometimes it's harder to be the spouse or the person watching than it is to be the person ill. Give her strength. Keep her faith strong. Keep Desmond's faith strong. Keep their marriage strong. May the time that you give them be ever more precious, Lord, because they know that it someday it will end. Father, we love this couple. We are so glad they're among us, and we ask that your hand be upon them. In Jesus' name, amen. And I want the miracle of learning how to make this thing so it doesn't constantly turn off on me like this. I know there's a setting somewhere. We'll get to it. There we go. Okay. So, we're getting close to the end of Leviticus. We're going to be in chapter 25 today. It's a long chapter. We're not going to read all of it, but there's two main sections, two main ideas in it. The first few verses deal with the idea of the Sabbath year. They were on a not just a 7-day cycle, they were on a 7-year cycle as well, where something happened in year 7. And then also after that, the year of Jubilee, which happened after 7 Sabbath years. And sometimes you'll hear me say 49 years, sometimes you'll hear me say 50 years, because the text kind of talks that way, and there's a little confusion. As you know, the Hebrew way of counting time was ever so slightly different than ours. Jesus spent about 36 hours in the grave, from Friday evening till Sunday morning. 36 hours doesn't sound like 3 days, but that's how it's counted. Part of Friday, all of Saturday, and part of Sunday. And so the 49-50 thing, when you read it, you count off 7 Sabbaths, 49 years. On the 50th year, you do this. And then there's other times it kind of sounds like when you're doing that on the 49th year. I'm not going to worry about that. The idea is that they are not only on a 7-year cycle, but they're on that longer cycle as well after 7 Sabbath years, and certain things happen then. Now, I wasn't sure how to approach these two areas because we don't celebrate either one of them. I mean, it's reflected in our culture a little bit. If you declare personal bankruptcy, how many years before you can do it again? 7 years. There's a 7-year cycle there for dealing with debt. But generally, as 21st century American Gentiles, we don't think a lot about the Sabbath year. We don't think a lot about Jubilee. But there's principles there, there's some interesting things there, there's wisdom there, there's kindness there that I think makes it worth us taking some time to look at it. So, a few different things before we start. One of the things that I saw in looking at this was the kindness of God. if you're in an agricultural society, my dad grew up on a dairy farm, and he was just one of the toughest men that I knew, because that's just how you grew up. His friends were tough too. It didn't make any difference if you were sick. You got up and milked the cows twice a day. And if you wanted to take a vacation, you had to find a neighbor to milk the cows, because you couldn't leave them for a couple weeks unmilked. It was very, very bad for them. And you had to plant the hay and bale the hay and get it up in the hayloft and all. It was work. And the idea that every 7th year, take a year off. Let the tractor be idle. Sleep in the morning, because you don't have to do all those things that are keeping you so busy 6 days a week for the other 6 years. So there's just incredible kindness. I wish I had a boss that said, hey, it's the 7th year. We'll see you next year.
Yeah.
And you can still eat and be paid and stay in your house. It's just an incredibly kind thing that God did to give him that kind of rest. The second thing is, or one of the second things is, we just came off one of only 2 stories in the book of Leviticus that's actually a historical account. Both stories end up in capital punishment, with God taking Nadab and Abihu back in Leviticus 10, I believe it was, and then taking the unnamed man of Egyptian father, Hebrew mother, in chapter 24. Blasphemed, stone him. So you go from this severity of don't you dare treat God with dishonor, disrespect, this incredible kindness. Take time off, relax, rest. I got it. I'll cover you. You'll eat. It's an interesting balance that we find there. I also saw just incredible wisdom in the commands that we have here. Sometimes you read things in Leviticus and you're just always looking beyond them for the spiritual meaning. You know, the 12 stones on the priest's ephod, I think they call it. And you're always looking, what does that represent? Well, the 12 tribes are always on the priest's heart. They're always before God. But the Jubilee and the Sabbath year were so incredibly practical. Just, you got to rest. In the year of Jubilee, the land returned to you. There's this incredible wisdom to prevent multi-generational poverty. There's a sense in which God is protecting the people from themselves in some of this, and it's wonderful and it's wise. Third thing I learned, and this kind of surprised me, there's scant, if any, evidence that Israel ever celebrated either of these feasts. And I'll give you reasons why when we get there, but that surprised me when I came across that. And I came across it from a number of sources, and they were good, solid, reliable sources. There's just no historical evidence. If every 7 years you got a Sabbath year, something happened in Israel in those Sabbath years that would have been recorded in Kings or Chronicles or something, and you never hear of it. I searched every way that I knew to find some evidence that they celebrated this and honored this.
Isn't that why they went to Babylon for the length of time they did, was to make up for the Sabbath years that they had not celebrated?
Yes, we're still in the introduction, but that's good. When we get there, there's a reason for why they were in Babylon 70 years. So hang on to that, because I think you're spot on. So that would be another evidence that they never honored what God told them to do. Those years came and went with no particular recognition or celebration. Let's see, where is it? Yes?
I was just about to say, would this be, from this kind of guidelines, would this be where some farmers get, where they basically kind of do like field rotation? Where they'll have multiple fields and say, okay, this field, this year, nothing, and we'll keep on going around, so next year it'll be kind of...
Well, first off, I would argue that the prescriptions in Leviticus are only secondarily agricultural in nature. They do have impact, and I think most farmers will tell you that unless you are very good with fertilizer and with other things like that, or crop rotation, that it's good to give a year off to a field. That it will actually produce more in the long run if you do that. But that's not how God argues. God argues, I want you to trust me. I want you to take a year off and know that you're not going to end up in poverty as a result. that you're not going to end up starving as a result. It's really a test, and then we'll get into that. I'm still in the intro here, guys, so give me just a minute. So Israel didn't really observe all these times off that God gave them. You all know people that have stored up their vacation, and they didn't take any vacation this year, last year, and all of a sudden the company all of a sudden says, hey, you've got to take your vacation. They're kind of doing that with nobody saying, well, you've got to take it. They went for centuries, as far as we know, without ever taking that prescribed rest. The fourth thing that came out of the study was really surprising to me. A lot of people use the year of Jubilee as a reason and as kind of a marker for trying to calculate when the rapture will be.
Mm-hmm.
Always a vain proposition.
Mm-hmm.
I watched one video, and I'll tell the guy's name. He's a nice guy, Chuck Smith. He founded Calvary Chapel. So he's preaching, and it's an older message because it was just his picture on the screen with the audio. And he's talking about the year of Jubilee. And he's saying, now, I've done the study, and I'm absolutely certain there's no way that the return of Christ, because he's going to return on Jubilee, there's no way that the return of Christ is going to be any later than 20 years from now. That message was preached in 1979.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, if you want to use anything to calculate anything, just get ready to be made a fool of. It doesn't work. It's not the purpose of it. But it is, if you go to YouTube and just Google Year of Jubilee, and everything that comes up is somebody trying to tell you when Jesus is going to come back. They don't deal in any depth with what it was actually about, why God gave it to them, even what implications it might have for us today. They just say, oh, I've calculated it, and this is when Jesus is going to come. The fifth and final thing that I discovered when doing this is, in addition to the kind of the unwise practice of trying to time the rapture off of Jubilee, people are trying to apply it in ways today that, first off, it was never applied back then. But secondly, we're not a theocracy. You can't take what happened in Jubilee 3,000 years ago and was supposed to continue during Israel's history and plop it down in 21st century America and say this is a good idea. It's not a good idea. So hang on to that. Those are the sorts of things I saw. Those are the sorts of things that we'll review as we go through here. So let's read. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest, or gather the grapes of your undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you, for yourself and for your male and female slaves, and for your hired workers and the sojourner who lives with you, and for your cattle and for the wild animals that are in your land. It's all its yield shall be for food. So those verses just contain instructions for the Sabbath year. It's the first section in Leviticus 25. And I thought, in interest of making us all better Bible readers, let's just go back and have you note the things that you can pull out of here, because there's a bunch of stuff in just these 7 verses here. You have your Bibles open, though. We'll just start here. Talk to me about that particular passage. Ron.
I didn't understand. It says you can't, when you come into the land, you can't sow your field or prune it or gather the fruit, but then it says the 7th year it will provide food for you. But
Right.
how does it
Because things grow wild. If you don't prune your vineyard and all that, it'll still produce grapes. If you don't sow the field, there's still seed that fell in the ground from last year and all that during harvest. So it'll produce some things. So that's part of it. And it's a little confusing. On the one hand, it sounds like you're saying, don't touch it.
Right.
But it's not saying that. It's saying, don't do your normal harvest. Don't do your normal farming things. Don't be pruning it and gathering it. And then what would you do once you pruned it, gathered it, put it in barn? You'd sell it. That's your business. Don't do that. leave it. And who are you leaving it for?
Yourself for next year.
Yourself, and who else?
Your sojourner.
Your servants.
Your servants.
Who else?
Animals.
The sojourner.
Yeah.
Normally, the poor people had to wait, as Ruth did, until the harvest is kind of over, and then they got to go in and get the pickings, whatever was left over. Now everybody's like a reset. Everybody's almost on an equal playing field. The owner can go in and pick the grapes they're growing, without any pruning or anything like that. His servants can go in, the sojourner, the widow, the orphan, they all have access to it. As that stuff begins to ripen, they can all do it. But you're not supposed to say, okay, guys, let's harvest this field, get it in the barn, and we'll start selling it. No, it was to be left. All that grew naturally, and it was available to anyone. So yeah, that's confusing, but that's what's going on. Maureen.
Two things. The second thing, that the Sabbath, there was to be no work. So you were not to work the land.
Right.
You could pick the fruits as they ripened themselves, but you were not to work the agricultural end of it to make them be fruitful. So that reminds me of when Jesus and his disciples were walking through the field and they were plucking the grains on the Sabbath.
No.
I don't think that was actually work, because this is implying that they were eating off of what was given to
I
them.
understand. And I don't know how to answer that question with authority, but I'll say this. When Jesus, he and his disciples are going through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and I think it's in Matthew 11 or 12,
Right.
whatever. And the Pharisees say, no. And Jesus doesn't say, oh no, it's permitted. He says, I'm Lord of the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Get over yourselves.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, by that time, they had their 613 laws, which weren't in place probably at this time.
Well, and a lot of those were best guesses of what God really meant.
Yeah.
So they made it a little bit more complicated. But I understand your point, is that could they go in here? Here's the deal. Wasn't there another 7-day cycle? So we have a 7-year cycle. There's a 7-day cycle regarding eating as well. What was that cycle?
Saturday was the Sabbath.
Saturday was a Sabbath. But what would you do on Sunday? You would gather enough for Sunday. What would you do on Monday? Enough for Monday. Saturday. What happened when Friday came? What would you do?
Twice.
You would gather twice as much. We'll get to the manna thing here in a minute. And so I don't know whether it would be considered a big deal that if you went in on the Sabbath and picked a few grapes and ate them. Probably not. But you might also consider that God is teaching them something here. And what he's teaching them is that you need to
Rely.
Hang on. There we go. Is that you're to depend on him and do things sometimes in an unusual way to test him. And he's testing you. Will you believe me? Because what happened if you gathered too much manna on a Wednesday, left some of it over till Thursday?
It rotted.
It rotted and got wormy. Ugh. What happened when you gathered 2 days worth of manna on Friday?
It was
It
fresh
was
and
good on
good.
Saturday. There's no natural explanation for that, folks. That's simply God setting it up in such a way to say, will you trust me? I know it doesn't always make sense to you, but I've told you, you can take a complete day of rest and still eat. So all that to say is, I would lean towards not regularly preparing and doing your stuff on the Sabbath, because God is kind of making a point. You can actually take a day off and I'll care for you. So it's a glorious, wonderful thing. What else do you see in here? Who is this? Monique?
Yes, isn't that something that for one day they don't have anything to eat? They could just fast?
Well, you weren't
Just
supposed
fast
you,
for
but
one day.
the purpose of fasting is not to say, oh my gosh, I don't have anything to eat today, so I'll fast. The
Oh,
purpose of
yeah,
fasting
yeah.
is to focus yourself on the Lord and to come before the Lord with prayer and with just really deep desire. It was a physical background to a spiritual activity. Otherwise, I mean, the poorest person would be the holiest person out there because they never had anything to eat. They'd be fasting every day. So yeah, it wasn't that.
It's not the intention.
Tell you what, grab one more, and then we're gonna
If I had never opened the Bible before and I opened it here and I saw the Lord spoke to Moses, I would be like, wow.
Yeah. Good, I like that. And here's why. Isn't this the way all the laws kind of show up? And the Lord spoke to Moses. Where's it happening? On Sinai.
Mount Sinai.
Here's my point. This carries the same weight in the community of Israel as thou shalt not steal.
Mm-hmm.
Honor your father and mother.
Yeah.
Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. The same setting, same thing. The Lord said to Moses on Sinai. And so my point is that when these people ignored it, they weren't, this wasn't like, oh, this little, no, this is just as important as the other ones. And in some ways it's worse, because this is just so incredibly merciful and kind, all that he's giving them, and they blew it off. So let me see what else, we got to roll here, we're only on slide 9. The Sabbath benefited the land. Darren mentioned something there. There's actually good agricultural reasons for letting you do it. But what does it say? Keep a Sabbath to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
That's the focus. The land is secondary in this. This is just like with the manna. When God gave the manna, he said, let's see if the people actually trust me. And some of them didn't. They would say, I don't know about tomorrow, so they'd gather a little bit too much and it would turn wormy. And so they had that issue. Will you trust him here? Will you work 6 years and take the 7th year off as a Sabbath to the Lord, reflecting his faithfulness, etc.? Now, not reaping, we talked about this, doesn't mean you can't eat what grows. It's just you're not going to do your regular farming stuff. This is the 1 year everybody's got equal access to whatever's growing in the field. It is a great reset in that sense. Let's see what else. Yeah. Oh, what? Now, I just said that a lot of this stuff is not as symbolic, at least not as immediately symbolic. It's a very physically practical thing. Take a year off. What, if anything, though, is symbolized in the Sabbath year? How about the ending of the curse? What was the curse on Adam?
Work.
Work,
By
the field, by pain and by the sweat of your brow. But not this year. This year, relax. I'll take care of you. Here it is. And to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Except this year.
Mm-hmm.
No sweat, no pain. Walk out, grab some grapes, enjoy your lunch. It is, if there's any symbolism at all in here, it is that one day the curse will come to an end, and you will not be eating because you sweated or because you worked hard. I think this is not a small thing. This would have been, by the way, part of a faithful person's messianic expectation. That when that promised seed from Genesis 3 comes, he's going to undo this whole mess that we made. The reason I say that, those of you that were with me in Genesis will know this. When Lamech, there's 2 Lamechs, this is the good one. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah. You remember what Noah means? Rest.
Rest.
Called his name Rest. Saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. That's a direct reference to the other verse in Genesis, that allusion at least, that we just read. You're going to work it by the sweat of your brow. It's going to be painful. This one will give us relief from that. This is Noah's dad hoping that his son is the promised seed. Now that's an over-realized expectation there, but he does become a type of Christ. He's the Savior of the world. If you wanted to live through the judgment of God in the flood, you better be on the boat with Noah.
Being retired, I'm not working and getting my food by my sweat anymore, but retired people are senior citizens, so are we in the 7th year of our lives? And that's why we don't have to work anymore.
So you don't have to go back to
You know what I'm
work.
saying?
No, I do understand what you're saying. You're retired, but you stay pretty busy, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
You just end up doing different
I'm
things.
married for 50 years, she's bludgeoned me into believing that. I keep busy.
I mean, I sort of retired for a little while. I'm unretired now, but I'm personal only, okay? I'm just not a big believer in retirement the way America practices it. Because part of the image of God is being productive. Part of the image of God is adding value to other people's lives. Part of the image of God is taking chaos and making order. And, you know, to look forward to, oh man, I got an early retirement. I retired at 58 or something like that. To do what? May I encourage a book for all of you? Don't Waste Your Life by John Piper. And it begins with a scenario set in Florida of, you know, John and Sylvia. They were actually real people that they were profiled in Forbes magazine or something like that. They had saved, no kids, I think, retired early, so they're like in their mid-50s. He's gonna play softball, and she's gonna collect seashells on the west coast of Florida. And he says, what will they do in that day of judgment? Lord, look at my batting average. Look at the shells I collected. And so, I know you stay busy and I know you minister, so this is not any kind of rebuke, but I would use that question, a very good question, to just encourage us to think about, once you're financially secure so you don't have to bring in income, what does it look like then to be faithful to the Lord? Maybe find some ways to give it away, give your time away, give your skills away. Yeah, so.
Volunteer, fill up your life with things that you didn't have a chance to be doing because you weren't working. So now that you're done, volunteer in the church, volunteer in anything that is.
This is good. This is good, but we're on slide 13 of 58. So, let's see. So once every 7 years, if people were to rest, not sow, not gather into barns, etc., but just glean whatever grew freely. And I can see concern on the part of the people. A year is a long time to go without, and actually, you normally had a year. You know, if you planted and harvested in this year, well, you don't get the next harvest for 12 months. Well, now he's saying, now you're not going to get it for 24 months. And it's like, are we going to make it? And you already saw people were a little skittish when it was just skip one day. Just trust me for food the next day. And they got skittish. How are they going to be when it says trust me for food and take an entire year off? So on the one hand, there's faithlessness in that concern, but God is so incredibly gracious the way he answers it. Here's what he says. And if you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year, if we may not sow or gather in our crop? That's the question they're going to ask. I will command my blessing to you in the 6th year, so that it will produce a crop sufficient for 3 years. When you sow in the 8th year, you will be eating some of the old crop. You shall eat the old until the 9th year when its crop arrives. In other words, I'll cover you. I'm going to give you, and this is why it's not merely, there's nothing agricultural that says, hey, in that 6th year, you know, the farmer in Iowa is just going to have this bumper crop every 6 years so they can take off the 7th year. This is a miraculous thing that God would do. He says, I will do this. I'll see to it that in year 6, you're going to need a bigger barn, because that food's going to last you for a long time. So you can take the year off, you can trust me, I can prove my faithfulness to you, and then you resume the cycle again. And every 7 years you get to test me in this. And every 7 years I will show myself faithful. Let's see. We already talked about, yeah, that's the manna. We talked about that. We'll leave it. Leave that. Oh, but I do want to say, the manna thing. How long did they get manna? 40 years, right? Whole time in the wilderness. So there's 52 weeks in a year. That's 2,080 times, guys. 2,080 times. They got to see the Lord's faithfulness. That they could gather twice as much on the day 6, and it would be available and not moldy on day 7. Here's my point. 2,000 times the Lord showed his faithfulness to him. And when it came time to Sabbath year and Jubilee, they didn't believe it. That's the nature of sin and unbelief in an unregenerate heart. A miracle for every week for 40 years, and they still did not believe. Which also makes me skittish when I say, I just need a miracle and I'll believe. Well,
Ha!
it didn't work for them. Marie, did you?
No,
Okay.
it's just, how many times did Jesus tell them, you've seen all of this and yet you don't believe?
Yeah.
Or there's another case where, well, just send someone when the guy was in hell and he wanted
Yeah.
a drop of water,
Yeah.
and it's like,
Lazarus and the
ain't
rich
gonna
man, it's
happen.
like, well, if they don't believe
Yeah.
Moses and the prophets, they're not gonna believe if someone rises from the dead. But I wanna go beyond unbelief here and suggest an even baser motive. Why in the world, when God says, I will take care of you, you can have a year off, would they say, nope, we're gonna plant and sow in year 7? Why? Greed, absolutely. If you do math, if you're, this is a 17% increase in your revenue. It is. So you get 7 years harvest instead of 6. And so you did it again and again and again. And as Maureen pointed out, from the time that they were settled in the land, they crossed the Jordan, a lot of warfare, but they get settled in the land and they begin their planting and sowing seasons. If you start counting from there to the beginning of the Babylonian captivity, you get right around 500 years. There's always a little bit of debate on the date. But 500 years would have meant that they had skipped 70 Sabbath years. How long are they in captivity in Babylon for? 70 years. God can count. He knows what they did. And I'll give you let me give you the verse here for that. Okay, all that is, here we go. Those who had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, and they were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it kept the Sabbath until 70 years were complete. That's pretty clear. They had ignored this Sabbath regulation for 70 times, close to 500 years. And God said, okay. One thing I see though is incredible patience. They ignored him for 500 years, and finally he said, okay, let's see.
Well,
Lionel.
There was also a correlation though with all of that neglect was the decline of people to the point where he did send them off to Nebuchadnezzar.
Sure.
So there's this correlation between corruption and faith and working with God.
Yeah, so if all of you heard it, it's not just probably the ignoring of the Sabbath here, but it started that way, and it just snowballs to where, well, we'll fudge on this command, we'll fudge on that command. We think we know better than God over here. We can take better care of ourselves than God can. And you start thinking and living that way, and pretty soon you get to where you're ignoring all the commands. You're intermarrying, you're sacrificing your children, and God just says, enough. So, okay, where are we here now?
Bruce,
Yes.
he was patient for 500 years, but then he was silent for 400 years.
Okay.
So there's, time is not the same in God's economy that it is in ours. Maybe 500 years was a second to him.
Oh, yeah.
So-
You know the verse in Peter,
Yeah.
to the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like a day. But yeah, I don't know of any significance to the 400 years other than just simply God has been talking to them forever.
Yeah.
He from Genesis 3, or Genesis 2 actually, on through Malachi, God is talking to them through Moses, through a prophet, through visions, through dreams. He's talking, and then all of a sudden he's just done talking. You talk about ghosting someone. So let's see, where are we here? Let me keep rolling here so we get this done. Okay, this is Deuteronomy, but it's talking about the same thing. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release. And this is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor, his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but whatever of yours is with your brother, your hand shall release. But there will be no poor among you, for the Lord will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess. So that it's kind of echoing that 7-year cycle in Leviticus as well. And it's interesting, we'll come back to it, but generally you sold one of two things. You collateralized your loans. You either collateralized them with your land, which we'll see a little bit in Jubilee, or you collateralized them with your labor. So if you became poor, you sold yourself, basically, to be an indentured servant. I will work for you for X number of years. And here it says, when those years are up, you let them go. Now, for some reason, you may still think, okay, he owes me a bit of money. And if he does, the Lord says, let it go. Don't exact it of him. But it goes beyond that. He says, you don't just let the guy go with the clothes on his back. You furnish him liberally from your flock. He's probably been tending your flock, just like Jacob tended Laban's flock. You furnish him liberally from your flock. You give him food, you give him wine, you take care of the person as you release them. You know, you've all seen the movies where, you know, they let somebody out of jail and they just walk out the door with $20 and the clothes on their back.
Yep.
And Leviticus says, don't do that. You get the guy started again. He sold himself to you because he was that poor. Don't let him leave poor, so that the cycle simply repeats. So, back to, well, why is the debt of a Jew forgiven, but not that of a foreigner?
He's a child of
Is
God.
God just a racist?
No, they're his chosen people.
I would say the Jews are under the law, the foreigner isn't.
Sorry?
The Jews are under the law, the foreigner isn't.
Okay, you guys are, you're circling, I think you're close. They're under the law, they're under covenant. If the idea is, if remission and that 7-year Sabbath is pointing towards something, pointing towards our ultimate Sabbath, pointing towards our ultimate rest, pointing towards the ultimate forgiveness of all debts, etc., then maybe it's important that the people that actually enjoyed that were people that were in covenant with God.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the whole world.
Yeah.
It's people that have entered into a covenant with God that can look forward to this, and it's modeled in this temporal way. That if you were part of the covenant community, your debts were forgiven. If you were not part of the covenant community, keep paying. It's not unjust. God is not treating the foreigner unjustly, is he?
Mm-hmm.
He's treating the covenant person with favor, and there's a big difference. So, let's see. Leave that. Amos, hear this, you who trample the needy, to do away with the humble of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over, so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath, that we may open the wheat market, to make the bushel smaller and the shekel bigger, and to cheat with dishonest scales, so as to buy the helpless for money, and the needy for a pair of sandals, and that we may sell the refuse of the wheat. I think Lionel was kind of hinting at that, is it wasn't just a few things here. This became the heart of the people. The Sabbath ceased to be a gift and became a burden. Can't wait for it to be over so we can start doing business and making money again, so the rich can get richer, and so we can buy people for money for a pair of sandals. We can sell the crappy wheat to people and demand an exorbitant price. We'll make the bushel small and the shekel big. That's what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very, in light of God's care for the poor, in light of him, laws of gleaning, in light of him giving that Sabbath year where they have full access to the field like everybody else, in light of saying, don't let that poor man who sold himself to you go free with nothing, you shall liberally supply them. And God saying there shall be no poor among you. You've got a society that develops to say, we're glad there's poor because we can take advantage of them. We can buy cheap labor. We can get rid of the junk that nobody else will buy. That's what developed.
And I guess
So-
it's still with us.
I'm sorry?
I guess it's still with us.
It is still with us. And again, I want to be careful not to just do one-to-one transfers from Jubilee and Sabbath year into American culture, and we'll talk about why in a minute. But the principle of caring for the poor, of not wanting there to be poor, of asking what does intelligent compassion look like, those principles should absolutely carry over. And maximizing profit just should not be the number one thing. You do need to be profitable. Nobody gains if a business goes bankrupt. But you want to share the wealth a little bit.
I was referring to the greed component.
The what component?
The greed
The greed, yeah.
component. Whereas there was a time when even a non-believer would not even consider opening their business on a Sunday.
Yeah.
And now we expect everybody to open, and we all support it.
Yeah. And the only thing I'll say on that very quickly is that we are not Israel. We are not under the Mosaic covenant. Our Sabbath, my Sabbath is Christ. And I'm glad I'm here on Sunday, which, by the way, we've moved it from the seventh day to the first day, the Lord's Day. We've made all kinds of changes, and I think they're justified. And I look forward to this being sort of a restful day, but I'll be honest with you, Sunday is really a restful day for me. But I do understand what you're saying. There is a kindness of God, even in a non-covenant people, to kind of recognize the wisdom of a cycle, a day off, etc. So let's keep pressing here. Maybe we'll get through this. If you despise weekly Sabbaths, which they did with the manna thing like that, and here can't wait for it to be over so we can open the store. If you despise Sabbath years, well then why bother with a 50-year celebration that was supposed to be this real high point in their calendar? It's just going to mess up your business plan even more. So here it is. You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Day of Atonement, you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land, and you shall consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. It's not that the term jubilee, by the way, comes from the name Jubal. If you remember Jubal from back in Genesis 4, he is the father of all who play the wind instruments, the horns and the trumpets and all that. And so Jubilee is probably named after Jubal and the sounding of the trumpet. It's sort of like getting a horn or the school bell that lets you out after a really, really long, hard day in school. That's what it signified. And it took place on the Day of Atonement.
Of course.
That's not accidental. Of course. Why not? So the Day of Atonement comes to symbolize that not merely the forgiveness of sins in the sacrifice of the one goat, the taking away from you your sin, the forgetting of sins, and the scapegoat who goes off into the wilderness, but just in the forgiveness of debt. You're free. You're free spiritually. You're free physically. It's a great reset and a great celebration that they were supposed to have. And it really does boggle my mind that they did not want to celebrate it, except what would you do if the government tomorrow said, okay, next January 1, 2024, nobody goes to work for a year? We'd probably say, what?
How would my life change?
Yeah.
Where does it say that they never celebrated a single seventh year or the Jubilee in the Bible?
There's not a direct statement. There's absolutely no record of them ever celebrating it. And the evidence is pretty strong that they did. I think you might have stepped out of the room when we put the one verse up there from 2 Chronicles, I think it was 16, that said, you're going to go into captivity in Babylon, and you're going to go there for 70 years because for 70 years, basically, you haven't given the land its Sabbaths. I'm going to give the land the rest that the land is supposed to have. And so if you look at when they first got settled in the land to when they went into captivity, it's about 500 years, which would be 70 Sabbath years. It's possible they celebrated the Jubilee, but why? The Jubilee was essentially a kind of a special Sabbath year, because it was marked off by Sabbath years. When you got to that seventh one, it kicked off, and you did a couple of extra things. But having seen the greed, when we want to buy the needy for a pair of sandals, we want there to be a big, cheap labor supply. So all these fields that I'm gathering, I'll have cheap help to harvest them, so I can get richer and richer and richer. When you see how the people thought and how the prophets rebuked them, I think it's a stretch to say, oh yeah, once in a while we'll take a Jubilee. No, because of the financial impact that it would have had. Marie?
It's 2 Chronicles 36, 20 to 21.
Thank you. Very good. So let's keep rolling here. Oh, the trumpet sounds on the year of Jubilee. Now there's a reason why people look for the return of Christ and key it off Jubilee, because when Christ returns, the trumpet will sound.
Yeah.
And you're told that in Matthew 24, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Thessalonians 4. So the trumpet has significance. However, you're on a slippery slope. If you read the text, it says, of that day or hour, no man knows, not even the angels, nor the Son of Man, but God alone, and say, well, I can't know the day or the hour, but I can get the year. You're kind of going against the grain of where Jesus is going with that. And everybody who has picked a year has made a fool of themselves. So don't make a fool of yourself. Let's see. Keep rolling here. Get this done. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of itself, nor gather the grapes from the undressed vines. For you it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You may eat the produce of the field. And that just sounds so, what in the world is he saying? He's saying you just don't do your normal harvest. You don't gather, but you can eat it. Anybody can eat it. So it's another Sabbath year in that sense. In that sense, a bit indistinguishable from the other Sabbath years, except they ordinary ones were not announced with the trumpet. This is, by the way, I was thinking about this last night. It kind of reminds me of how Eden was supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't going to be farmers in Eden. They were just going to kind of, if there's a weed, I don't even know if there'd be weeds in Eden. They're probably a result. Mosquitoes and weeds are probably a result of the fall. But they could just eat freely. What are they doing on Sabbath years and on Jubilee years? Eating freely.
Mm-hmm.
The exact command given to Adam and Eve, you can just eat freely of anything except one thing. Well, they can just go and eat freely again. They don't have to worry about harvesting. They don't have to worry about gathering into barns, because God will supply them day by day. Okay, now this is what makes the year of Jubilee unique. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his property. And if you make a sale to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. You shall pay your neighbor according to the number of years after the Jubilee, and he shall sell to you according to the number of years for crops. If the years are many, you shall increase the price, and if the years are few, you shall reduce the price, for it is the number of crops that he is selling to you. You shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear the Lord your God, for I am the Lord your God. Fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. So here's what's going on. You know that God gave land to each of the tribes, except the Levites. The Levites were scattered throughout the land so that they could serve all the tribes. You didn't have to travel to the land of Levi to get priestly service, because they were scattered out through all the towns, etc. If you had to sell your land for any reason, so let's say your husband died and you're a widow, and I don't have the strength or the capacity to farm 20 acres or whatever you've got like that. It might be better if I sell it, let somebody else who's got a lot of servants and all that, so I'll sell it. And your husband died halfway between two Jubilees, so you got about 25 years to go. That man is supposed to pay you 25 years worth of crops. And so you had this pile of money now that you were able to live on. You were essentially leasing your land and the value of the lease was calculated on how many crops could be grown on the land until the next Jubilee. So when you ran out of money, if you were hopefully careful with it, guess what? You got your land back. Because if you were careful, you would have spent the money in such a way that when Jubilee comes, your pile of money's getting pretty small, but your field is once again yours. Now, if your situation has changed, if you have remarried, or if you'd had young children and now they're grown up and they're adults and they can work the farm, well, then the land was yours again, and away you go, you farm it. It's just incredibly wise. I mean, one of the great blights on our culture is multi-generational poverty. Families that just can't seem to break out of it for one reason or another. This was just a glorious way to battle multi-generational poverty. Of course, he didn't follow it, which is why God says in Leviticus, there won't be any poor among you. I think that was actually in Deuteronomy. What does Jesus say? You're always going to have the poor. Because you don't follow what the Lord told you to do. So there's always going to be rich and poor in the land, where it was designed to at least level it out a bit. What happens here now, and this is, Jeff is preaching on Luke 4, by the way, which is Jesus basically saying, this is the year of Jubilee. He does not use those terms, but he talks about, I've come to set the captive free, etc. And it's recognized as a year of Jubilee. And we did not plan this, by the way. This is just the kindness of God. You're going to get 2 doses of Jubilee today. One much more physically, spiritually focused from Jeff, one a little bit more physically focused here. But debts were not actually forgiven, were they? They were just paid off. Because your debt was based on the number of crops. You get to the end of that time period, but it's still a cause of celebration. We just paid off Heidi's car the other day. Nobody forgave anything, but it still felt really good, to not have any debt. And you get the title in your hand, and that's our title. But this is even better. Your debt is now paid off, and your assets are back in your control. If you need to sell them again, lease them, you can lease them, but they're under your control. So I'm going to keep rolling here. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. That's really interesting. It's not your land anyway.
Yeah.
My land, God says. I gave it to you. You can lease it to someone else, but you can't give it away. You can't sell it. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. You don't own any land ultimately on this planet any more than God lives on this planet. He's a sojourner, he says, and you're a sojourner with me. This is not our home. Very interesting text in the Old Testament to see that. Let's keep rolling here. Quickly, a brother could redeem your land. So let's say you'd sold 25 crops, 25 years, all that, and now you've got a brother or a friend or a relative who says, I've had a few good years. I've got extra money here. I'm willing to redeem this for you. So you could go to the person that you had leased it to, and you could buy yourself out of the lease. It was a fair, honest transaction. Nobody got cheated. It just brought the land back under your brother's control a little quicker. You could show mercy and kindness to your brother and get that land back in his hands without waiting for the year of Jubilee. Or if he goes to work in some other endeavor and makes money himself, he can buy it back. So you can always buy yourself out of the lease.
So this is the kinsman redeemer.
Right.
What's that?
The kinsman redeemer.
Yes. Yep. This is the kinsman redeemer. There's something really interesting here. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner. Wait a minute. Shouldn't you support the stranger and the sojourner as though he were your brother? Isn't that backwards? You know what he's saying? You find it easier to show pity on a poor stranger or sojourner than you do on your own brother. And I thought about that. It's like, well, you had the same chance I did. Why didn't you do better with your land, with your opportunity? We tend to judge that way, whereas if somebody comes in and they have an accent, they're from a different country, a different setting, we might more naturally feel some compassion and say, well, let's treat them well. Let's make sure they get a fair start here. But man, you had a chance and you blew it.
Is it?
And so he turns that on its head.
And that fast forwards to Jesus having no respect in his hometown.
Yeah. Okay, let's see, I'm gonna roll through this stuff because it's 10 o'clock here. I wanna get to the, okay, so here's the deal. Forbes magazine I mentioned, Reuters magazine, back about a little over 10 years ago, both were publishing articles quoting economists that says the way out of the recession that we're kind of getting out of back in 2010, 2011, maybe one of the ways out is a year of Jubilee. Just start forgiving consumer debt. And several different people, Art Lindsay, Kevin DeYoung, others commented on this, of that's really bad reading of what you do with Leviticus. And so here's the reasons. We're not an agrarian society. What 20 acres do I give you? We just don't function that way. Somebody might live in New York in a penthouse that costs $5 million but has no land. How does he swap out with a farmer in Iowa to re-level that playing field? They measured wealth by land primarily, and of course on land you had your crops and you had your livestock and all that, but if you didn't have land, it was hard to make money. So a resetting every 50 years of having the land go back to the person that God gave it to made sense. It was an equitable way of getting the table leveled again. But telling a tech billionaire to swap out with a dairy farmer just isn't going to work in our culture. Our property is not assigned by God. God says, the reason I'm doing this is that I gave that to you to be a steward of. You can lease it if you need to, but you cannot sell it in perpetuity. I'm the Lord. We don't get to say that in America. He's your personal Lord. He's the Lord of this church. Ultimately, he's the Lord of the universe, but he's not recognized as the Lord by our culture, by our laws, by our society. And so you can't go to this. Here's the other thing. You really want to go to Leviticus, America? You want to go to Leviticus for sexual morals?
Nope.
You want to take a PETA meeting in here, people for the ethical treatment of animals, and go to Leviticus and see what we're supposed to do? You know, they're cherry picking in the extreme and saying, well, we don't like most of God's wisdom, but we really like this. And so be careful. We're no longer in a zero-sum game. It used to be, if wealth was measured in land, if I got more land, I got wealthier and you got less wealthy. It was a pretty easy way to measure. But now we have businesses that create things. And so the owner can make money and become wealthy, and he can hire people and give them good jobs and they can become wealthy. It's not a zero-sum game. We create value and wealth all of the time now. Did you have a hand up? Okay, very good. We're not Israel, and we're not in covenant with God. These are covenant promises, part of the old covenant. We are not under it, and we don't get to just, okay, let's do this. If it's wise, if it's compassionate, if it's honoring to God, and if we get societal agreement, well, absolutely. But this is not a command to us. And this is the one that's a little controversial, but basically Jubilee was not about debt forgiveness. It was that your debt was paid off. Finally, it had been paid off, the land was returned to you. And if you go, well, wait a minute, that kind of sours my understanding of Jesus being our Jubilee and all that. Jesus is a better Jubilee. Here your debt is paid off because you gave up control of the land for X number of years, and the guy farmed on it and made money, and what he gave to you, he's now paid back. It's a justified, economically sound way to do things. There's some mercy in it because you get your land back, etc. We have a better Jubilee in Christ. So I kind of messed up Jeff here a little bit because then I talked to him about 10 minutes before class started. He goes, oh, yeah, I got to think about that. Because it's normally thought of, oh, debts are just forgiven. Well, actually, collateralized debts are just basically paid off at that point. Now, I think there is some debt forgiveness because there's verses that say you shall not exact it from him. If that year comes up and he still owes you a bit of money, let it go. That's clear. But that's not the primary thing. Darren.
I just say similar idea about the Day of Atonement, that hey, the sins are forgiven, but it's temporary. You're gonna do it again next year. You know, so like this, it's not, you know, the year of Jubilee.
Except they're not forgiven, are they?
No.
They're just paid off.
No, here, they're, yeah.
Yeah.
But I was just saying, it's just something that's gotta be done over and over.
Yeah, so you do have that.
Yes.
So, okay, good, I'm glad you said that. One of the things that Hebrews does is to say, we had all these Levitical sacrifices, all these ceremonial things, and you had to do them year after year after year after year, which means they don't really work.
Mhm.
But now we have one sacrifice, and now the curtain is torn in two, and now that's done. So the fact that you had to have one Jubilee after another Jubilee after another Jubilee, even assuming that they observed them, it says we need a better Jubilee. So, roll down here really quickly, because I do want to just get to the principles. Here's principles I think we can take from it. Create policies that reflect intelligent compassion for the poor, because that's what Jubilee and Sabbath years are about. They're about faith in God, but they're also about caring for the poor people, and especially breaking that cycle of generational poverty, not letting your culture get into that. Second, create policies that just reflect a humble awareness that not everyone starts the race at exactly the same place. I happen to grow up in a two-parent family, or two-parent home, where dad grew up on a dairy farm, mom grew up in World War II England. They brought a work ethic, they brought a sacrificial motif into the home that I resented when you're 7. You know, you don't want to work very hard, you want to watch cartoons, but I'm so grateful for now. If I had not been brought up in that particular environment, especially without a father, I suspect I'd either be dead or in jail. And we tell those stories another day. But I just thank God for a family that, with common grace and principles, just kind of pointed me in a particular direction. Not everybody has that. And so what does it look like to care for the person who, it's not so simple as saying, just get your act together, because they're not starting the same place that you're starting. So policy should be there. The one thing that jumps out at me from Leviticus is you need to be scrupulously honest and absolutely fair. I used to do what maybe some of you have done. If I had to go buy a car, and that car was worth $25,000, I'd start out at about 18. And see if I couldn't get the guy down to like 22 or something like that. And he wasn't all that happy. Sometimes they say yes. And you say, free market, that's how you do things. Yeah, sort of, maybe. But I wanted him to be glad to see me next time I walk in the door. Not too glad, but glad. And so I've taken to just say, what's a fair price for this? Do some market research, comment, okay, the fair price for that car is $23,000. I tell them, I've done my research, $23,000 is fair. If you're good with that, let's make a deal. If you're not, no problem, I'll go on someone else. I don't dicker anymore. I just try to be fair, and that's what God told him to do. Is that stop trying to get the best possible deal. You're taking advantage of people. Just pay a fair price. Look for ways to lift others up that do not rob them of their dignity. And then we'll end here. Here's the deal. When that 50 years came, it wasn't say, here's a big pile of money, best of luck. No, here's your land. It's valuable. Work it. Add value to your family, add value to your culture. There is dignity in work. It's a good thing. Work is not a result of the fall. Sweat is a result of the fall. You were always designed to be a worker. And so find ways that, and this is why I'm so hesitant for policies that create a dependency that never ends.
Mhm.
It's not that we can't afford it. That's not it. We can afford it. It's that it robs somebody of dignity, of getting their own paycheck, of having a little extra so they can actually share with someone else. Don't rob them of the dignity of being an image bearer. So there's all sorts of wonderful financial wisdom you can pull out of Leviticus 25, but just student loan forgiveness isn't one of them, in my humble opinion. So
Amen.
let's pray. Father God, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for the wisdom in it, for the compassion. You care, Lord. You care that people not only trust you, but they deal with one another with respect and with justice and with mercy. Thank you This is just an incredible book, and we thank you for the way you're blessing our lives through it. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Bruce.
My pleasure.
But I still think you're very ambitious to think you're gonna get to